Here's the man of the hour. Bjorn Bjorholm is the founder and bonsai artist at Ace and Yen near Nashville, Tennessee. He teaches and lectures nationally and internationally. He offers full bonsai services. He has a beautiful bonsai nursery and shop and supplies and pots. He teaches an online series called Bonsai U. And he studied in Japan, and help me with the name of the nursery.
Fujikawa Kokaen.
Oh yeah, no way. I can't say that. And you studied in Japan from 2008 to 2017?
Yes.
Before coming and settling in Nashville for his at his current nursery. I've been fortunate enough to hear Bjorn lecture before. Y'all are in for a treat. And he's going to explain the process of how his presentation is going to go. And without further ado, I'm looking forward to hearing you. Bjorn, please.
All right. Thank you guys very much for having me again for a meeting. I'm looking forward to showing you guys what we put together. I've been asked to do kind of a schedule for the year for conifers, and so I decided to make this more juniper specific. So the video we're going to be watching today will walk us through basically spring, summer, fall, and winter as to how to care for your junipers, fertilization, soil type, watering, placement, all of these different kinds of things. You know, the time of year rather that you can do certain techniques like pruning or heavy wiring, heavy bending. So it's kind of a good catch-all as just an explanation of what to do with your junipers from the beginning of the year through the end of the year. So the way this will work, I will play each season. Yeah, so as we get through each season, I'll stop the video and then I'll do a question and answer with you guys. To make this easy, since we got a lot of people in the video here, in the Zoom call, if you guys could just type your questions into the chat. If you go to the very bottom of the Zoom screen here, there'll be a little button that says chat. If you click on that, you can type your questions in, and then I will read those out and answer them back to you each time we stop the video. So if you guys are cool with it, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we're going to start the video watching the introduction and the spring segment.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai U. This time around, we're going to be talking about everything juniper bonsai. Now, I know what you're thinking. We talked about junipers many times before, but this video is going to be a little bit different in that we're going to build a maintenance schedule for the entire year for all of your juniper species. So essentially, we're going to start out in the spring talking about what to do with your trees as they wake up from winter dormancy. Then we're going to get into summer maintenance, what you can do during the summer season, everything from fertilization to watering to creating shari, for example. We're also going to talk about what to do in the fall in terms of techniques, again, that can be applied to these trees at that time of year. And then, of course, how to overwinter these plants for better success and healthy growing in the long run. So without further ado, let's dive into juniper bonsai. So first up here, let's talk about the biology and physiology of junipers. All junipers fall under the genus of Juniperus, and they're all in the cypress family. Now, in the Northern Hemisphere, there are over 50 species of junipers, and all of these, of course, are gymnosperms, meaning that they produce cones and seeds, but not flowers and fruits. And of course, those cones and seeds are going to be produced on the males. Now, when it comes to juniper foliage, technically junipers are an alternating leaf pattern tree, but you'll also find opposite leaf pattern and whorl leaf pattern kind of mixed in there, so they're a bit of an irregular leaf pattern. Now, this will come in handy a little bit later in this episode when we talk about how to prune these guys, so definitely bank that for later. Now, in the world of junipers, we have, of course, old world junipers and new world junipers. So there are dozens and dozens, of course, like I said, more than 50 species in the Northern Hemisphere alone. But of the old world junipers, these are the ones that we're most likely to use for bonsai because of the characteristics of the deadwood and the foliage. And of the New World junipers, these are the most common species that we utilize in bonsai right here. Now, when it comes to juniper foliage, you really have two different types. Those that produce elongating shoots and those that produce a bit more of a tight kind of balled up look to the foliage. So it's not that one is necessarily better than the other, but it's good to know which one you're working with because the techniques employed might vary just slightly from tree to tree. So just to give you a really good example, a very concrete example, if we're looking at Juniperus chinensis, so those trees that are growing in Asia and specifically in Japan, The elongating version, or those that throw the elongating shoots, would be something like Itoigawa. Now, of course, many of you, I would assume most of you, know what Itoigawa is. It is a variety of juniper that grows in the Niigata prefecture of Japan. It's considered the tightest and finest and most beautiful foliage in the Juniperus species range for Juniperus chinensis. Now, juxtapose that to the Kishu, which grows in Wakayama. The Kishu tends to ball up a little bit more, doesn't throw as elongating of a shoot as an Itoigawa. But if they're pruned properly, you can produce a very similar effect in terms of producing very tight padding on those trees. And we're going to dive into pruning these guys a little bit later in this episode. Now, in addition to those scale type junipers where the foliage is very tight and compact, we also quite often work with junipers that have a bit more of a spiky version of the foliage. So for example, Juniperus procumbens Nana, which is right beside me here. The standard version of this in Japan would be just Juniperus procumbens. And of course, this is referred to as sonare in Japanese. We also have Juniperus rigida in Japan, or what's known as Tosho. And the analog to that here in the United States, and actually in Europe as well, is the Juniperus communis, or common juniper. So the way that we prune each of these is going to vary slightly as well. And again, we are going to dive into that later in this episode. All right, so first up here in the spring season, let's talk about repotting. Now, when it comes to timing for repotting your junipers, these are typically pretty hardy trees. So really, you have a wide range in terms of timing in the spring when you can repot them. So this could be in the very late part of winter while they're still kind of a purpley brown color, while they still have that winter coloration, all the way up until the point that they've greened up later in spring. Now, as a general guideline, I typically recommend repotting these guys kind of mid-spring. So as you start to see the color change just a little bit in the foliage back to a slightly more greenish coloration, that's when I would repot. So for us here in Nashville, that usually means the first or second week of March, but of course you're going to have to adjust this based on your particular climate. Now, when it comes to the aggressiveness with repotting, that's going to be somewhat species dependent. Now, most Juniperus chinensis, you can get away with a pretty heavy repot, meaning that we can take off at least 30–40% of the soil, if not more, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of the roots without much of an issue. Now, if we're talking about, say, Juniperus chinensis Itoigawa, if we get more aggressive than, say, 40 to 50% of the roots being removed at once, that might cause the tree to revert to juvenile foliage in the subsequent growing season. And if we're dealing with something like a Juniperus rigida, for example, or a Juniperus communis, so our needle juniper or our common juniper, if you get that aggressive with it, taking off more than 30–40%, you could actually kill the plant. So you do need to be somewhat careful with certain species. On the flip side, though, if you're working with something that has very strong roots, like a Juniperus sabina, for example, from Spain, this would be something that you could get pretty aggressive with in terms of removing soil. You could actually bare root Juniperus sabina or sabina junipers by actually pressure washing out all of the soil. And this is something that if you live in Europe and you're dealing with Yamadori or collected sabina junipers, I actually recommend that you do this. This is the only conifer, the only collected conifer, whether it be juniper, pine, spruce, whatever, that I would recommend actually removing all of the soil. Because if you don't do that within 2 to 3 years after collection, quite often sabinas will end up with major fungal problems in the sort of system of the tree, the cellular structure of the tree, and you end up with dieback, sometimes of the entire plant. So I do recommend within 2 to 3 years of collection on sabina junipers that you fully bare root them. But I would never do that on, say, like a Rocky Mountain juniper or an Itoigawa, for example. That would be a very, very bad idea. Now, when it comes to soil type on junipers, they tend to prefer a little bit of an acidic soil, so somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.5 to about 7. And actually, this is true for most of your conifers. They're going to fall in that range. That being said, if your soil is slightly more alkaline, just above 7, not really that big a deal. You can bring that down to some degree by using certain fertilizers that are going to add acidity to the soil. But for the most part, I recommend using a very porous mix for all of your junipers. So for example, like a 1-1-1 of Akadama pumice and lava rock, or maybe adding in some Kiryu, which is a relatively acidic soil medium, into that mix in a 1-part ratio as well. So a 1-1-1-1 of Akadama pumice, lava rock, and Kiryu would be a great mix. If you don't have access to all of these components, if you just stick with the Akadama pumice and lava rock, you'll be fine. Or if you want to replace the pumice with Kidiu and just do Akadama, Kidiu, and lava rock, that would be fine as well. But we want to make sure that these trees are in a very porous mix, but that we're watering them pretty frequently. And we're going to dive into watering here next. Now, when it comes to watering your junipers in the spring season, they typically are starting to take up quite a bit of moisture at this time of year, as all trees are, because they're producing that first flush of growth. So from early spring onward, I would recommend that you're checking these trees every single day. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have to be watered every day, but if the soil is drying out, say for example, the surface looks relatively dry, it's probably time to water. So this is one benefit of using a very porous mix. You know that it's draining quickly. And then if you can quench that thirst of the tree at the proper time of day, which could be any time of day, as long as it's done within a short amount of time after it dries out, the tree will respond really, really well to that. Now, in addition to watering the soil surface on the tree, I also recommend that you mist the foliage when you water as well. One thing you have to be careful of is that this can cause fungal problems, particularly in the spring. You know, you're seeing a lot of fungal issues arise at this time of year when temperatures are getting up to around like 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So like 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, somewhere in that range. So if you're spraying the foliage at that same time, you might end up exacerbating fungal problems, but we are going to dive into how to treat fungal issues coming up here shortly. So that should mitigate that issue. But particularly if you have done a heavy root pruning on a juniper in the spring, it's usually a good idea to mist the foliage subsequent to that, because the tree is going to be transpiring tremendously through the foliage. And if it doesn't have enough roots to take up the moisture from the soil, which it won't if you've done a heavy root pruning, you need to supplement by misting the foliage. And this can be done just with the water wand. You don't have to have a special wand that you twist the end of and it produces a fine mist. You can use the same wand that you're using to water the base of the tree, the soil of the tree, and just mist the foliage with it as well. All right, so this brings us to our pests and diseases in the spring season. Now, you're probably not going to run into too many issues with your junipers at this time of year on either end of that spectrum, but things to look out for would be, say, for example, cedar apple rust. Now, this is something that we have a big issue with here in Tennessee because we have a lot of Juniperus virginiana, which is a carrier of cedar apple rust in the local environment here, and that will transfer over to certain species in the garden like Juniperus scopulorum, which is Rocky Mountain juniper, or ash juniper from Texas, for example. So I have to watch out for that here at the garden and spray accordingly. Now, normally that disease isn't going to manifest until a little bit later in the spring, say in early April here. You know, our spring starts in early March, so about a month after temperatures start warming up a little bit, when we start seeing some rains in the area, that's when we'll run into cedar apple rust around here. So in order to treat that on our trees in the nursery, we have to obviously cut that out, try to remove it. Remove as much as possible, and then spray the trees with the active ingredient myclobutanil, which we can find in a product here in the States called Immunox. So if you live somewhere else in the world, I would recommend trying to find a product with that active ingredient in it and spray your trees with that in the early spring season in response to this disease actually manifesting on the trees. There's not really a reason necessarily to spray preemptively with it. It's not necessarily going to inoculate the trees against it, but it will help treat the trees if you do see that in the spring season. Now, when it comes to pests in the spring, really the only thing that I worry too much about on junipers would be borers. So in order to treat that, I am applying imidacloprid, the active ingredient imidacloprid, in the early part of spring. I usually do it as a granular, applying that to the soil, so that that absorbs up into the tree and inoculates the plant in that first part of the spring. So you can buy many different product names as long as the active ingredient is imidacloprid. That should help you out. Now, if you're living in Europe, you might want to find a product that has an active ingredient called dimethoate. I don't believe we can get that here in the United States, but I know in certain parts of Europe, you can get access to that. It's another great product that you can use to treat for borers. But borers would be the main thing in terms of pests that I would look out for in the early spring season. Now, in terms of fertilization in the spring, I recommend that you start applying fertilizer to the soil of the tree as you start to see the foliage green up in the first part of spring. So for us here, it'd probably be the first or second, maybe the third week of March, when I start putting cakes or say Osmocote Plus or something on the soil surface. Now, the type of fertilizer that I'm using at this time of year will be dependent on the stage of development of the tree, of course. So if it's a young tree that is in early development, we're just trying to blow up the size and put as much tissue on the tree as possible. I'll use something with a very high nitrogen, well above a value of 10. If it's something that is further along into later stages of development, maybe moving into kind of early refinement, I'll keep that nitrogen value closer to 10. And if it's something that is highly refined that we're just trying to maintain as is, I'll use a nitrogen value fertilizer below 10. So I'm going to put a link to the PDF for our fertilization schedule below this video, so you can check that out and apply those different types of fertilizer accordingly. Now, I also recommend at the same time, as you start to see the foliage green up, that you start applying a foliar spray or foliar fertilizer to the tree. Best thing you can use is a mix of liquid fish and liquid kelp. So I use a product here in the States called GS Plant Food. And of course, this is listed as well on that PDF down below. So definitely check that out. But you can purchase this product, put it in a fertilizer injector system, and then apply it through the hose as you're watering the soil surface of the tree. So you can actually water the root system of the plant and spray the foliage with this fertilization on a bi-weekly basis if you want. I recommend doing it at least twice a month if you can. Once a month is okay as well, but if you can get twice a month or possibly even every week or every 10 days or so, that's even better. So this will be applied at a rate of about 2 tablespoons per gallon using that fertilizer injector system. So last but not least, in the spring season, let's talk about pruning and wiring. As with all trees at this time of year, it's best to do absolutely nothing in terms of removing foliage, pruning back shoots, or wiring and styling the trees. The reason being is that doing these techniques at this time of year can weaken the trees, and you'll end up with a weak growing season for the rest of the summer. Now, there are exceptions to this. So for example, if you do a really heavy root prune on a juniper in early spring as part of a repot, I recommend that you remove some foliage to offset overtranspiration of the foliage relative to that now smaller root system of the tree. So this could be cutting off unnecessary branches, removing underside foliage, cutting out crotch growth, but do not touch the tip growth on your junipers, because we want to allow the hormonal interaction to happen within the plant, which is basically the auxin in those elongating shoots being transported down to the root system while the cytokinin is being transported to the top. So you get this hormonal crosstalk happening within the plant. And if you're cutting back the shoots at this time of year, you're disallowing that to happen. So we want to make sure we leave those tips completely alone, but you can remove whole branches if you need to, again, to offset overtranspiration if you've done a heavy root pruning and repot in the early spring.
Okay, excellent. So what I'll do, I'm going to read through the questions that are in the chat here. So if you guys want to start throwing some of those in there, while you're writing your questions in there, I'll just mention a couple of things. First off, apologies if you're hearing a buzzing noise in the background of the video. That was the cicadas on the day that I filmed this out in the nursery. They were incredibly loud. So I didn't realize it would come to the speakers so much. So hopefully that's not too bad on your all's end. The second thing is that this video is going to be going up on our Bonsai U platform. Actually, this Wednesday, it'll launch on the platform. So you guys are seeing kind of like the world premiere of this video. But the Bonsai U platform is essentially a learning platform where we put up demonstrations and videos every week. And we also do live Q&As with our members several times a week, kind of in a similar setting to this, where people will type it into the chat and then I'll respond to those questions in real time. So if you're interested in checking that out, you can go to my website and follow the links on there to see how to join that. So it's a nice community. We've got hundreds of members at the moment from all over the world, which is why in this video I keep mentioning Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, Celsius, Fahrenheit, all that kind of stuff. We got people from all over the world who joined up. So let's see here. Let me jump over into the chat and we'll see what kind of questions we've got in here. Okay, so I got one here from John. He says, do you notice junipers waking up in spring as a response more to temperature or to light or like day length, for example? It really is a combination of the two. It's true both in the spring as they're waking up and in the late summer going into fall as they're starting to shut down and go into dormancy. So, I'll just give you a couple of examples here. There are some places in the bonsai world, like at the North Carolina Arboretum, for example. They have built kind of like an underground cave where they will put their trees, all conifers, all deciduous trees, everything underneath there. At least they used to do this. I don't know if they do it anymore, but they put them in basically complete darkness all winter long. And of course, that keeps the temperature basically stable all winter long, keeps it, kind of right around freezing, just above freezing. So the trees stay dormant, but there's not those crazy, temperature fluctuations. The problem is in the spring or late winter going into spring, they're in the dark there, and you take those trees and put them right back out in the sun. You can run into a few problems. But one of the main issues is that you got to make sure that you're sort of reintroducing them slowly to the light, so that you wake the trees up in concert with the temperature changes outside. So it gets a little bit difficult to do something like that. Excellent. All right. Let me go back to the chat here and find the next question. I got one here from Rita. Rita says, what was the fungicide mentioned before imidacloprid? It is something called Immunox, which is the product name. It's made by Spectracide, but it contains an active ingredient called myclobutanil, which is what I use to treat for cedar apple rust in the spring. And everything that I use at my nursery is available off the shelf at any like Home Depot or Lowe's. Now, that being said, with the laws in California being slightly different than other states, I don't know if you can get all of those products necessarily, but most of that stuff is available across the United States. So, I'm using things like Cleary's 3336, of course. We're using Subdue Max. We're using Infuse. So I'm using a whole bunch of different stuff when it comes to fungicides. So if you want to, check out that PDF, definitely consider joining the platform there. All right, got one here from, is it I Michael or L Michael? It's general juniper question. I'm reading old bonsai magazines and see a lot of needle junipers. Is that the same as common junipers? So if you're reading old, like Japanese bonsai magazines, when they're referring to needle junipers in there with the translation, they're more than likely referring to Juniperus rigida. Whereas, our needle junipers that we talk about in the rest of the Northern Hemisphere around the world would be Juniperus communis. They're very, very closely related. Obviously, different species. One is Juniperus communis, one is Juniperus rigida. Characteristics are nearly identical. So I'm not sure exactly genetically what the difference actually is. It's probably some minute difference. One is probably from the lineage of the other, or maybe they're divergent and they're from two separate directions essentially evolutionarily, but you end up with very similar characteristics. So the reason that Juniperus communis is called Juniperus communis is because it is found everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere around the world down to a certain latitude, I believe. So yeah, it doesn't matter where you go. You could go to Russia, you could go to Europe, around the United States, I'm sure probably Mongolia, China, all sorts of different places. You'll be able to find Juniperus communis. But we just basically refer to Juniperus rigida typically is called needle juniper, and Juniperus communis is usually called common juniper, just to delineate between the two with the common name. So most of the time when you see needle juniper, it's referring to rigida. Okay, got one here from Aaron. Aaron says, for newly collected junipers, do you fertilize with a high nitrogen or something lower? I would recommend with newly collected trees that you avoid putting really high nitrogen fertilizer on them, at least for the first growing season. High nitrogen can burn new roots as they're emerging in the soil. And when I say high nitrogen, we're talking a value above basically 10. If you keep the value at 10 or below, it's very, very difficult to over apply it and burn the root system of the plant. So, sticking with organics, even like organic liquids, for the first year with your newly collected stuff is probably a better approach than chucking on a whole bunch of, say, Miracle Grow or Osmocote Plus. Not necessarily a good idea. Now, in the second or third year after collection, depending on the tree, depending on what I'm trying to do with it, sometimes I will bump that up to a really high nitrogen fertilizer. Like, for example, in my nursery here, I've got a few pinyon pines that were collected, I think, about a year and a half ago. And this year in the summer, I decided to throw a lot of Osmocote Plus on them to see if I couldn't get them to produce a lot of back budding, because they were very long and leggy, and it actually worked really well. They exploded with buds everywhere. So it does depend on what you're trying to do, but I wouldn't do that necessarily in the first year after collection. I would use something with a much lower nitrogen value at 10 or below. Steve is asking, how often do you recommend repotting juniper? I would try to push back the repotting as much as possible. So if you can get away with every 3 to 5 years, that would be great. That being said, if the tree's growing gangbusters and filling up the pot with roots and the water's not penetrating anymore after 1 or 2 years, or the soil breaks down so much that water's not penetrating after a year or two, it's okay to go ahead and repot in those situations. But with conifers, and particularly older conifers, the older they get, if it's a collected tree that's 100, 200, 300 years old, the more time you can put between each repotting, the safer and healthier it is for the tree. So I always try to push that back as much as possible, balancing that with the breakdown of the soil and the filling up of the pot with roots. Let's see, Robert is asking, would you treat a femina like a needle juniper as far as root pruning? From my understanding, I don't really work with femina at all, but from my understanding, they're a very strong tree and you can get much more aggressive with those. I would equate them probably more to like what am I thinking of here? There's a blue Alps juniper. That's what I'm thinking of. So if you guys have ever been to Brussels Bonsai Nursery in Olive Branch, Mississippi, which is kind of near Memphis, Tennessee, they've got hundreds and hundreds of these blue Alps junipers that look kind of like a mix between needle juniper, a femina, and kind of a blue rug juniper, kind of all mixed together. They grow very, very quickly. They put on a ton of growth. You can cut the living daylights out of the tree. You can cut 80-90% of the foliage off and they'll spring back almost like a yew, for example. You can do the same thing with the roots on those. I would assume with the femina, you can get pretty similarly aggressive with them, but don't quote me on that. Don't want to put you down the wrong path, but in talking to people who do work with them, particularly out in California, that seems to be the case. Let's see here. Rita's asking, can you spell? And Gabriel wrote myclobutanil. Yep, that's correct. That's the correct spelling there. Okay, Noah's asking, you mentioned removing old soil when repotting Sabina junipers within 2 to 3 years. How do you handle native soil on repotting US native junipers? Okay, so when it comes to basically all other conifers, not just junipers, but pine, spruce, all that kind of stuff, I want to leave a core of old soil, typically up underneath the trunk. It's what's referred to as the shin in Japanese, S-H-I-N. But it's just an old core of soil. Now you can slowly pick away at that a little bit over time, but with most old conifers that are collected, you're never going to fully remove that or fully replace it. So it all depends on the situation. This is one thing that's hard about teaching bonsai, is that there's so many variables that it's hard to say 100% of the time you're going to do it this way or that way. But I typically would recommend, particularly when you do kind of a first repotting, this is after a tree's been collected, say it's been in pumice for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and it's healthy and it's ready to move over to a bonsai pot and bonsai soil. I would leave at least the same diameter of the trunk as the core soil underneath, and maybe 1.5 to 2 times the diameter of the trunk. So just a little bit larger, than the trunk itself would be kind of the minimum I would probably leave. So again, it's going to be situational. Sometimes you're not really going to have much of a core because the tree was collected in a really dry environment, and a lot of that soil just sloughed off when the tree was collected. But you definitely want to leave a core up under pretty much all other conifers for the most part. The Sabinas are the only ones that I would recommend that you actually do bare rooting. Let's see here. Joe is saying, I may have missed you cover this, but will the video be available to watch later? I'm new at this and I'll never remember all this. Yeah, so it's being recorded on here, and I think Dodie is putting together a YouTube page for you guys for the group. So it should go up on there, so you'll be able to access this later. Or if you want to join our Bonsai U platform, right now we've got 150 to 200 videos, and we're putting out new videos every single week with live Q&As and stuff. So once you join that, as a paying member, you have access to all of that library and then all of the new videos that are coming out as well. So it's a good resource, I think, and you can go back and watch those videos as many times as you like. Donna's asking, is cedar apple rust a problem in any area of California? What climate might be a problem? I don't know out in your all's area if it's much of an issue. I would assume that it's out there. It's pretty much everywhere, it seems. One thing you have to keep in mind with cedar apple rust is that it tends to bounce back and forth every other year between junipers and plants in the rose family. So of course, roses, Chinese quince, chojibai, flowering apricot, hawthorn. So all the cool species that we use for bonsai are susceptible to infection with cedar apple rust. What you have to keep in mind is that it typically isn't like a death knell for a tree if it gets cedar apple rust, particularly junipers. It doesn't tend to kill them. It just gives this really ugly orange goopy substance on them in the spring. So, this year we had a little bit on, well, we had a lot on the Junipers virginiana, the eastern red cedars in the landscape here. We had a little bit on some of our Rocky Mountain junipers and ash junipers in the nursery, but it doesn't seem to affect, say, like one seed junipers, California junipers. I haven't noticed it on. Any of the chinensis, Junipers chinensis, the US strain, if you will, of cedar apple rust does not seem to affect Junipers chinensis. So you shouldn't really have much of an issue there, but it will bounce back and forth every other year between stuff in the rose family and juniper. So since we had it on the stuff in the rose family this year, I'm expecting maybe some plants next year that we have in the nursery in the rose family might be infected with. Okay, let's see. Next question here is from Mike. Mike says, any advantage to adding fir bark to mix for environments like the Sonoran Desert or of Tucson? Yeah, so the more arid your environment, the denser your soil you probably want to have. So you could add things like pine bark, fir bark, things like that. Or if you want to still keep with the typical soil components that we use, like the Akadama, pumice, and lava rock, in those really arid environments, you might just want to go 100% Akadama. That's actually totally fine, as long as it's relatively high fired Akadama, so it doesn't break down on you, because you're going to be watering pretty frequently. You should be okay. So nothing wrong with adding those things in there. You're going to have to adjust your watering habits a little bit, of course, and you're probably not going to get as rapid of growth as you would if it was a more porous mix and you could quench the thirst of the tree as that soil dried out as needed. But of course, I'm sure you work full time, so you can't be out in your yard 5 times a day checking the water on your trees. I will say too, living out in a really arid environment like that, junipers tend to, for the most part, at least most species of junipers, really like moisture in the air, humidity in the air. And this is true for a lot of the desert junipers too, like the Utahs, and particularly the one seed junipers, which grow kind of in the 4,500 foot elevation areas of, the Four Corners area, for example, in New Mexico. It's very dry, very arid there. But once we get them to Tennessee here, where we have 80, 90, 100% humidity all the time in the air, they explode with growth. The only plants that I've noticed that don't do well here, and I think it's humidity based, are the California junipers for some reason. So there might be something there, that might be a better option, in a very arid environment like that. But if you're wanting to do chinensis or one seed or most of these other junipers, if you can have misters going off throughout the day to keep the humidity up around the trees, that will offset some of the transpiration, and you can probably potentially use a bit more of a free draining mix, water that a little bit less because you get more humidity in the air, and get better growth out of the tree overall. Let's see here. Donna's asking, is mycorrhiza important to junipers? Is that the reason for the sheen? Yeah, so, basically most trees have evolved to form a symbiotic relationship with some species of mycorrhiza, whether it be ectomycorrhiza or endomycorrhiza. So, if you've ever repotted junipers, you probably won't really see like what you would see with a pine, for example, which is that sort of white, sort of powdery looking stuff in the soil. That's the mycorrhiza with pines, particularly black pines. You're not going to see that same sort of white substance on juniper roots, but that doesn't mean that there's not mycorrhiza in there. It's just a different species of mycorrhiza for that given species of juniper that it's evolved with. Hopefully you guys are hearing me okay. So, yes, there's definitely mycorrhiza in the sheen of the tree, and this is true again for all conifers. But I don't know if I would say that, that's the reason for the sheen necessarily. I'm sure there's some research on this, so we could probably look into a bit more. I'll see if I can pull some of this up at some point. And maybe next time we do a meeting like this, I can answer your question in a little more depth when it comes to this. But mycorrhiza, to answer your question, is important for juniper, just like it is for pines. But it looks a little different from tree to tree, or from species to species. Noah's asking, how do you approach top dressing junipers during repotting? Is there anything special? I typically don't do a top dressing. I usually don't do a top dressing on any of our trees here, unless it's a tree that we've changed the angle on so severely that part of the root system is now sort of sticking out of the pot, and we need to cover that with, say, sphagnum, for example, or it's potted in a way where the soil might actually sort of wash away. So yeah, to answer your question, the only top dressing I usually put on any of our trees is really done in response to soil washing away or roots being exposed, and typically for me that's basically only sphagnum moss. And I will grade up that sphagnum moss to make it a little bit finer. I don't like putting big globs of the sort of long stringy, long fiber sphagnum on the soil. I like grading it up a bit more because it does kind of work its way into the soil and the root system on the surface there just a little bit better, and it seems to lock in place and hold better. You can grate up like green moss in there as well. If you've got a favorite species of green moss, you can grate that up in with the sphagnum, and sometimes it'll spore in the sphagnum. It doesn't always work, but it's one way to potentially help produce more moss on the soil surface if you want. But those are the only real things that I do when it comes to top dressing.
So first up here in our summer season, let's talk about watering. Now, junipers obviously are transpiring quite a bit through their foliage, and quite often we keep these trees relatively dense, particularly as they get a bit further along into refinement. I like to keep the trees quite heavy in terms of their foliar density, which means they're going to be losing a lot of moisture through their foliage throughout the day. So I recommend at the very least that you check these trees twice a day for water. It doesn't mean that they have to be watered twice a day necessarily, but in most instances, when the temperatures are getting relatively hot, even if it's pretty humid out, they're probably going to require watering twice a day. So I usually recommend, if you can, do it around say 9:30 or 10 in the morning, and then check again around 3:30 or so in the afternoon. That's a perfect schedule. Obviously, most people work during the day, so that's not really a possibility. So at the very least, if you can water early in the morning, really soak the core of the root system of the tree. Also miss the foliage at that time of day. And then when you come home at the very end of the day after work, repeat the process again. If the soil is dry, deeply water it, and maybe miss the foliage one more time. Now, if you're coming home late in the evening and it's already starting to get dark, probably don't want to miss the foliage at that time of day because it can cause or exacerbate fungal issues on the foliage. So you might avoid that. But for sure in the morning, definitely water the base of the tree and miss the foliage. Now, if you live in a really arid environment, most junipers are going to thrive with some moisture in the air, some humidity in the air. So you might actually want to install some misting systems that are going to go off periodically throughout the day. So for example, if you're living in a place like El Paso, Texas, you might want to have misters that go off, say like once an hour for maybe 15 seconds or so, or maybe, every 3 hours or so for like 30 seconds to a minute, something like that, just to keep some moisture in the air and make sure that the foliage is actually staying a bit more on the moist side. You'd be really surprised how much junipers actually really like to have their foliage misted, even during the hotter parts of the day. Not really that big of a concern. So this is actually something that I'll do if I'm watering at 10 in the morning and say at 3 in the afternoon. I'll mist the foliage at both times of the day, even though we're pretty humid here. And as you can see, we get tremendous growth out of our junipers on a very consistent basis in a very short amount of time throughout one growing season. All right, next, let's talk about fertilization in the summer. Basically, we're just rinsing and repeating what we did in the spring. So for example, if we're dealing with trees that are very young and we're trying to blow up the size of the plant and put on a lot of growth, I'll use something with a very high nitrogen like an Osmocote Plus. So if I had applied that Osmocote Plus, say in the first part of March, for example, I'd want to wait at least 2.5 to 3 months or so to reapply more Osmocote Plus to the soil surface. So that might mean, say, early June, for example, I might reapply it, and then I'd wait again 2.5 to 3 months and then reapply it once more. So typically with the younger trees, I'll apply something like Osmocote Plus usually 3 times in a season, maybe only twice. Whereas if we're dealing with trees where we're applying organic fertilizer to the soil surface, most of the time that fertilizer is spent after about 4 to 5 weeks. So if we're starting to fertilize our trees that are highly refined, like this juniper here in early March, I'm going to have to reapply fertilizer in early April, again, early May, early June, so on and so forth throughout the entire growing season. Now, one question that I get is when the trees go into summer dormancy and they shut down, say, for example, in late July going into early August when it's really, really hot out, would you reapply fertilizer at that point? And my answer is yes, because you don't really know when the trees have fully shut down. They're still going to be taking up some of that fertilizer from the soil or from the roots of the tree, even while they're in summer dormancy. So go ahead and reapply it at that time of year as well. In addition, I'm going to continue to also do our foliar spray or foliar feeding using liquid kelp and fish. And that's going to continue, every 2 weeks or so throughout the entire growing season. Now, I will recommend, as it gets hotter in the season, make sure you're doing this in the early part of the morning, because as the temperatures heat up during the day, the stomata, which are basically like pores on the foliage, will close up. Whereas if it's early morning, the temperatures are a little bit lower, the stomata are going to be more likely open at that time of day, and the tree is going to take up a lot more of that fertilizer through the foliage if you missed in the early morning. Now, you could also miss at the end of the day as well, but again, this could cause potentially fungal issues with the tree. So I recommend morning when you're doing your foliar feeding on your junipers. So next up, let's talk about fungicides and pesticides in the summer growing season. Now, on the fungicide side of the spectrum here, you're probably not going to have to worry too much about too many issues during the summer season. Really, at this time of year, we're much more worried about pests. That being said, I do recommend that you still spray preemptively every other month or so with some sort of fungicide. Typically, a systemic would be best because it's longer lasting than just a standard topical. So again, you can reference the fungicide sheets or the PDF via the link down below. Now, when it comes to pests, though, the main thing you're going to need to look out for at this time of year, particularly as it heats up and dries out a little bit in the summer, is mite infestations. So this is something that's relatively common with certain species of junipers, particularly Kishu. So if you're dealing with Juniperus chinensis Kishu, you're probably going to run into a mite infestation at some time during the year. So you can spray with things like malathion, for example, or Bonide 941, which is a systemic. You can spray preventively with those things, but if you do see a mite infestation happen on your trees, which usually manifests with the foliage turning kind of a grayish, unsightly color, it looks very weak and kind of dull in coloration, then you're going to need to spray, and you're going to have to spray for mites or to treat this mite infestation several times over the course of about 2 weeks. So typically what I recommend is that you find a couple of pesticides that treat for mites and alternate between those two, spraying about every 4 days for a 2-week period. That way you're killing off the adults, the babies, and any eggs as they hatch, making sure that you're completely killing off that entire infestation across the tree. So again, as the temperatures heat up, as it dries out, this is something that's pretty common with certain species of junipers. So next up here, let's talk about pruning and wiring in the summer season. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the spring, we're letting the hormonal exchange happen within the plant. So we're allowing
It's so funny because some of the people throw out all these different chemicals or stuff you can't get here and there, and then they have it shipped. And then I'm like, I put some insecticidal soap on it.
Whoever isn't muted, if you can mute yourself, please. All right, I think we're good.
Now, once we get to, say, late May or early June here, typically early June, this is when I'll do my first pruning of those elongating shoots. Most of that hormonal exchange within the plant, that crosstalk, has basically happened by that point. It's done, and it's time to prune back. So depending on the species of tree, this will dictate how I prune. So for example, if we're talking about all of our Juniperus chinensis, for example, or say Rocky Mountain junipers, any of these really elongating species of junipers, I'll go through and remove basically all of the elongating tips across the whole tree. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to grab it, pinch it and rip all that foliage off. I'm just looking at pruning back the longest shoots, usually with scissors across the tree. And as I prune those back, I'm cutting back to the next side lateral shoot that I think is going to fit into the profile of a given branch. When I cut that shoot off, that then activates those side lateral shoots to start growing and filling in. So as those elongate, we're going to let those run for the rest of the season and then prune those back again at least one more time, typically sometime in late August or early September, or possibly 2 more times if we have rapid secondary growth on these junipers. So for example, if we do the first pruning in early June, maybe by the end of July or early August, I might have to prune again. And maybe we might have to prune one more time in, say, mid-September, for example. So you can get anywhere from 3 to 4 full flushes of growth on these elongating species of juniper during one growing season. So we can put on a tremendous amount of density and foliage in one season. So to make this a bit more understandable, I've brought this Itoigawa Shinpaku here into the workshop against the white backdrop, so you can really see in detail how we prune these guys up. So let's bring the camera in closer and I'll show you what this looks like. All right, so let's take a look at how to prune these shoots back in a little bit more detail here. So you can see we've got our elongating terminal shoot out here at the end. We can prune back to kind of a general profile back into this area here, and that will then activate these side lateral branches to start growing. That's pretty straightforward. Now, a question that I get asked a lot is how far back down the shoot can you prune? And if you look further back down here, I don't know if you can really see in the video, we've got back down here, we have side lateral branches, but they just don't have the same coloration to them or the same look to them as these a little bit further out. So if you were to come through and cut this branch, let's say back to here, and leave just this foliage on here, not only is that not really enough foliage to keep the branch going, but what is left on here, these really are not viable tips. They're kind of spent. You can see there's no fluorescent green at the ends out here, which is a sign of viability. And they just kind of look shriveled up to some degree. So these are old needles on the plant or old side lateral buds on the plant. And I would not recommend that you cut back that far. Now, if we're talking about something like a Sabina juniper, for example, these trees, even though the roots are very strong, the foliage isn't that strong. So I don't recommend that you prune back all of the elongating shoots all at once on a Sabina. You can severely weaken the plant, you can kill branches, or you can kill the entire tree. So with Sabinas, I recommend that you prune only the longest shoots to start with in, say, early June, for example, or after everything's come out and hardened off, basically. And then later in the season, prune back those secondary shoots that maybe were a little bit shorter in early June, but still need to be pushed back to a general profile to build out the look of the tree that you're going for. Now, if we're talking about something like needle juniper, whether this be Juniperus rigida, Tosho in Japan, or Juniperus communis or common juniper here in the United States or Europe, you want to make sure that these trees have fully flushed out. They need to look like shaggy dogs, which again is going to be around like late May, early June when we do the first pruning. And if you notice here, you can prune anywhere in the length of the shoot where the shoot itself is actually green. Not the foliage, but the actual physical shoot, the shaft of the shoot. As long as it's green, you can prune back in that area and it will produce back budding a little bit further back down. So this means you could leave a shoot a ½ inch long. You could cut it back to 1 millimeter long if you wanted to, and it's still probably going to produce side lateral buds and a secondary flush of growth. Now, again, with needle junipers, you are going to want to allow these to flush out a secondary time and prune them back once more, which again is going to be usually sometime in late August or early September. It's very rare to be able to prune a needle juniper 3 times in the season. Usually twice is enough. So let's take a quick look here as to how to prune Juniperus procumbens, and specifically in this case, Juniperus procumbens nana, or dwarf green mound juniper. So there's a little bit of confusion when it comes to pruning these guys because they are very different really than, say, a Itoigawa or a Kishu. As I mentioned before, with those species, we really don't want to grab and rip the foliage because you're going to end up basically removing all of the growth hormone from all of the tips across the tree, and that could weaken the plant. Now, when we're talking about Juniperus procumbens, again, that same rule generally applies to these guys, but we can get a little bit more aggressive when it comes to pruning them because they're a little bit more forgiving. They're somewhat similar in a lot of ways to rigida in that we can actually prune each individual shoot in the area of the shoot where it's green and it's likely to produce a secondary flush or at least a new bud or several new buds in that area. So let's bring the camera a little bit closer and I'll show you what this looks like up close. So for example here, if we have an elongating shoot like this one's pretty obvious. You could prune anywhere in here as long as you're pruning back to viable secondary or side lateral buds here. So this is chock full of them. So just like an Itoigawa or a Kishu or any elongating species of juniper, sort of scale species, we can prune back like this. That's totally fine. Same thing within each branch here on these side lateral branches. You can see we've got the viable tip now at the end, but we also have secondary branches along each side. So just like a Kishu or Itoigawa, we can prune those back as well. Now, in addition to that, you could also, if you wanted to, come through and pinch the ends of some of these tips here, and they are still likely to bud a little bit further back down, just like a rigida, like a needle juniper, for example. Now, that being said, I do not recommend you grab the foliage and just tear through it. That's probably not a good idea, because you're taking not only the strong tips, but also the weak tips and potentially causing damage to the branch. You're going to weaken those weaker areas even more, and they'll probably end up dying off. So really, this is just applicable to a lot of the stronger shoots on the tree and stronger tips on here, but you can prune those back at the very end if you want to. Now, typically, I don't worry about getting that aggressive or that detailed with it. I'm just going to go through basically like a Juniperus chinensis and prune back the elongating shoots and just get it to fill in. And that typically is enough. You can also clean up the undersides of the pads, obviously, by pulling that foliage off and actually create a really refined look to these guys without doing hardly any wiring on them. Now, when it comes to wiring and styling junipers in the summer, you can do it, but I recommend that you don't do any heavy manipulation of the branches because, of course, this can cause dieback. If you want, though, as you're thinning the trees out and pruning them back for the first time in June, for example, this is a great time to detail wire these trees. I do a lot of this work here at my nursery at this time of year, as well as when I was an apprentice in Japan. We'd spend a lot of time not only with the elongating and scale-like junipers, but also with the needle junipers. When it came time to prune them, we would also style them up. That way you can build a very basic structure on the tree, and the tree will sort of grow into that with a secondary and sometimes third flush of growth later in the season. So as long as you're not putting heavy wire on, having to wrap raffia, for example, splitting branches, separating dead wood from live tissue, it's okay to wire these trees in the summer season. Now, another thing that you can do at this time of year is actually create shari on these trees. So the tissue on the plants is taking up a lot of moisture at this time of year, so it's very easy to remove bark from the live tissue of the tree or remove live tissue from the plant. So for example, if you have a shohin sized tree and you want to expand the shari, this is a great time of year to do it. You just want to make sure you're not getting overly aggressive by removing too much tissue, because again, this can weaken the trees during the summer season. Now, one thing to keep in mind with pruning your junipers in the summer is that certain juniper species or varieties or cultivars are more likely to revert to juvenile foliage than others if they're overly pruned. So for example, if you're working with something like Itoigawa or Rocky Mountain juniper here in the United States, if you prune more than, say, about 40% of the foliage in one go, the tree's probably going to revert to juvenile, meaning that the scale foliage will turn to kind of a spiky foliage. Now, it's not the end of the world. This will revert back to adult foliage within a year to 4 years, depending on how extreme the reversion was. But basically, all you need to do if this happens, if you do get reversion to juvenile foliage, is just leave the tips alone, because the adult foliage or the scale foliage will revert from the tips out. So essentially, you're just creating an elongated internode across the tree. So again, not the biggest deal in the world, particularly if you're doing an initial styling on a plant where you need to remove a lot of foliage, or doing, say, heavy bends later in the year, which we're going to cover when we get to the fall section here in a few minutes. You might get reversion on these trees. Not the end of the world, like I said, it will revert back. It's just kind of elongating the internodes and delaying the developmental process of the tree. Now, in terms of placement of your junipers in the summer season, they can take full sun and will be completely fine. However, if the temperatures are starting to rise up into the 90s Fahrenheit or the mid 30s and above Celsius, you might consider putting these trees in partial shade. So we actually have a lot of our junipers here under 30% shade cloth at my nursery, and that tends to green the trees up a bit more. It gives them a little bit of respite in the hottest part of the summer, and they tend to grow a little bit better. That being said, the best situation would be to be able to remove this shade cloth, have it be retractable, for example, or put your junipers in morning sun or afternoon shade so that you're getting as much air circulation as possible. Leaving the shade out permanently like this, not necessarily the best thing. You might end up with some fungal issues if the shade cloth isn't built high enough. Now here at my nursery, we've built this very, very high, so there is a lot of breeze and wind that actually blows through here, so we don't really have much of an issue, but quite often that's not possible for a lot of people. So morning sun, afternoon shade tends to be the best during the hottest part of the summer. Now, in the summer season, we also have the opportunity to do some grafting on our junipers. And specifically, we'd be applying approach grafting techniques to these trees. Now, usually I will do this after the trees have fully flushed out. The first growth has basically hardened off and it's time to start pruning these trees, which again is going to be for us in kind of early June here. So this is the perfect time to do this type of grafting at that time of year. So we've actually covered this technique in previous episodes of Bonsai U. So definitely go check that out under the Juniper tab in the Bonsai U library. But essentially the goal of this technique is, of course, to change out the foliage on the plant, or maybe relocate a new branch into a new position, or maybe even relocate the entire root system of the tree. But it does involve carving a channel in the understock or the receiving tree, and then inserting a whip of whatever desired juniper foliage that you have into that groove. It then forms a bond between the donor tree and the receiving tree. And within a year, typically, we can remove the roots of that whip and now we have a new branch, or we can remove the foliage of that whip and leave just the roots and have a new root system in a new location on the tree. So this juniper right beside me here actually had that technique applied to it about 5 or 6 years ago. It was originally a kishu, and actually there's still a little bit of kishu foliage left up here at the top, but I grafted through approach grafting this beautiful Itoigawa foliage down below. And as you can see, it's starting to look really good. We do have one final graft that was put on last year where the roots haven't been removed quite yet, but later in this growing season, I'll be able to cut that off and we'll have a brand new branch on the back left side of the tree. So this is a really fun technique, a really easy way to change out the foliage or the position of a branch or the root system on a tree, but we do this during the summer season.
Okay, excellent. Looks like we got a few more questions over in the chat. So let me scroll up here and find where we left off. Okay, here we go. Got one from Joe. Joe says, you mentioned something about repotting before they green back up. The junipers I'm familiar with don't really change color. Yeah, so this is going to be somewhat dependent on the species or the cultivar and also your particular climate where you are. So in the winter, in much colder climates, like for us here in Nashville, for example, we are zone 7A or 7B, depending on who you talk to. So we get pretty cold here in the winter, down into the teens in February, for example, and sometimes down into single digits. Like for the last few years, we've had several days in February where it gets down to say 7, 8, 9 degrees. So during that time of year, the trees will become typically like purple or brown sometimes. And this is what's referred to as shimoyake in Japanese. It just means frost burn, essentially. It doesn't mean that it's burning and damaging the foliage. It's just a name that's applied in Japan and as a result of being exposed to relatively low temperatures. So like I said, it depends on the cultivar of the species. So there's a saying in Japan, I think I actually mentioned this in the next section, in the winter section in this video, that the deeper the brown or purple color the foliage on an Itoigawa changes in the winter, the better the foliage is supposed to be. I don't know how actually true that necessarily is, but that's what's said in Japan. So, a lot of our junipers will change that color. Hinoki cypress will change that color as well. A lot of your conifers will kind of turn to a weird coloration in the winter. And then in the spring, as the temperatures rise and the daylight hours get a little bit longer, that will change back to a greenish color. So that's what I was referring to there. Let's see here. Samuel is asking, do you flush the hot water out of your hose before watering? Yes, I do. Especially in the summer here. I mean, it's very, very hot outside. If you turn the water on and then put your hand in front of the hose, it's so hot that it's not going to burn you. You're not going to get like a second degree burn or anything from it, but it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortably hot. So I wait for that to blow out of the hose before I start watering the trees. There is some evidence that could damage the plants. I don't know if it would necessarily kill a plant, but it can potentially damage the plant, particularly if you're blasting it on the foliage when it's super hot. I definitely don't recommend you do that. David is asking, if you're using an organic fertilizer, the label suggests fertilizing monthly through the growing season. Would you recommend that through the growing season? Yeah, I mean, if it's an organic fertilizer, usually that stuff filters through the soil pretty quickly. It depends on the type that you're using. Obviously, if it's a liquid, it's going to go right through the soil. The tree's going to take up whatever it's going to take up, and the rest gets flushed out. If you're putting cakes or tea bags, for example, with powdered fertilizer on the surface, most of that will filter through and be spent after about a month. So usually you can tell if like a fertilizer cake, for example, is spent if it's shriveled up, it depends on the type of cake you're using, obviously, but say if you're using something like tamahi, which is really common in Japan, it's sometimes imported to the States in these tin containers, and they're like 50-cent piece size fertilizer cakes. You put those on the soil surface, they'll ferment, meaning that they'll form a bond between the base of the fertilizer and the soil surface. It's kind of like a fungus, like a white fungus will form. That's the bond that forms, it ferments, it leaches out all of the nutrients. And then when it's done after about 4 to 5 weeks, the fertilizer cake won't disappear. It'll shrivel up just a little bit and become very dry and sometimes crack. That's a sign that it's time to take it off. When it comes to like, fertilizer, like powdered fertilizer, for example, or say Dr. Earth, something like that, if you put that into a tea bag and place that on the soil surface, the tea bag starts to shrivel up once the fertilizer is spent, essentially, which is usually after 4 to 5 weeks. So yeah, I'd switch those out, following that throughout the entire growing season. Okay, got one here from San Diego Bonsai Club. Is it necessary for organic fertilizers to be in direct contact with soil to derive maximum benefit, or is it placement of organics into tea bags as effective? Does burying the tea bag somewhat make any difference relative to soil contact? Thank you. Yeah, so this kind of touches back a little bit to what I just said about the fermentation. So if you live in really, really dry and arid environments, and this is coming from the San Diego Bonsai Club, so that'd be right up your alley there. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to bury the fertilizer down into the soil a little bit. Maybe not completely cover it with the soil, but at least wiggle it down and kind of bury it a little bit deeper so that it stays wetter and doesn't really fully dry out. Every time it dries out, the fermentation process stops, basically. So if you can get it to stay somewhat wet by burying it down into the soil, if you're in an arid environment, it's going to continue to ferment, which is what you want. So hopefully that answers your question. If you need clarification, feel free to add another question a little further down in the chat. All right, Mike is saying, what sort of treatments to the trunk and branches during the summer season are performed, or do we let it be? Yeah, so if you're talking about, say, like cleaning, for example, cleaning dead wood or cleaning the live tissue, maybe like debarking the tree and rubbing the live tissue down with sandpaper, for example, to brighten up the live vein, you can do that type of work anytime during the year. It doesn't really matter. I usually recommend with most junipers to do that twice a year is usually good. So you could do it spring, summer, or spring, fall, or summer, winter, 6 months apart, something like that. One thing you have to be careful of in the summer, though, is if you're removing the bark from the tree to clean the live vein and get it nice and red, the tissue is very soft at that time of year, so it's very easy to pop off too much and expose say the phloem or the cambium, or even accidentally get all the way down to the xylem underneath the live tissue, or underneath the bark rather, which is not a good thing. Obviously, it can weaken the tree. So, I usually don't do much of that, debarking and cleaning in the summer. I typically am waiting until, like spring, like, late winter and then fall, essentially. So about 6 months apart there. And the reason I do that is, to really with the dead wood is just to make sure that it's not, getting fungal issues on it, rotting over time. You clean it with, say, a toothbrush and water to get all the gunk off, and then you paint it with lime sulfur. And then the live tissue, I'm cleaning that mostly for aesthetic reasons, but also when you remove the first layer of bark there, the outer layer of bark, you can expose, creepy crawlies and other things that might be under the bark, and then treat for that if you notice something, is moving, up the live tissue of the tree. So it's good to do that at least a couple times a year. Let's see here. Noah's saying, I watched a video where the presenter suggested cold pressed or hydrolyzed fish fertilizer. I found a product called Fish On in the Bay Area, but I haven't tried it yet. Have you heard of this, or should I stick to standard fish emulsion? Yeah, so there is a lot of evidence that cold pressed fish emulsion is better for plants for many reasons. So if you can find a product like that, I recommend that you use it. The product I use with the GS Plant Foods, I believe that it's cold pressed, if I'm not mistaken. It seems to work super well. And really, before, I guess it was up until last year, I was using their product that was just liquid kelp with no fish emulsion mixed in there with it. This year, I started using the pre-mixed fish emulsion and liquid kelp together. And the growth that I've gotten on the trees this year has been tremendous. I mean, everything in the garden is just super, super green. I don't know how clear it is in the video, but it's very, very bright green. I didn't add any, saturation or anything to the video. That's just the natural colors. I mean, obviously the camera is going to affect it a little bit, but those are the natural colors that are coming out of the nursery. So, very, very bright green, or dark green rather, really, really nice quality foliage this year. And I attribute that a lot to switching over to the premixed fish and kelp. So you can get that GS plant food product on Amazon. It's just the letters G, S, and then plant food. Just type that in. You'll find a whole bunch of different sizes, different products and whatnot. But the premix liquid fish and kelp is, I think, what you want.
So the first thing in the fall season to look at here would be watering. Now, of course, these trees still have a lot of foliage on them at this time of year, so they're going to be transpiring through that foliage, and I would recommend that you check them at least twice a day. I will say you might want to back off on the foliar misting at this time of year because it can exacerbate some fungal issues, which we'll cover in the next section here. So just basically water the soil surface of the tree and make sure that you're really soaking that down when you water. Quite often as the trees start going dormant, people will back off on the amount of water that they give in one go because they think the trees don't need it. But the problem is if you're doing just a light sprinkling each time you water the tree, you're probably just wetting the soil surface and not actually soaking the core of the tree. And little by little over time, that ends up drying out and you end up with dieback on the tree. So make sure you're fully watering the trees when you do water them. And again, I would recommend still checking twice a day at this time of year, even though you may only have to water once per day or once every other day as the trees taper off into dormancy. This brings us to our fungicides and pesticides in the fall. So as always, as the temperatures start dropping down to around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or say 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, this is when you're going to see a lot of fungal issues arise on your trees. So one of the main things you're going to run into this time of year is something called phomopsis or tip blight. It's basically a disease that affects the tips of juniper growth. They'll turn kind of brown and desiccate and then die off. So if you notice that this is forming on your trees, go ahead and remove that foliage, either slough off the tips or cut off the foliage entirely, and then treat the tree with something like mancozeb. Now in the States here, Bonide is a maker that produces a product with that active ingredient mancozeb in it. And I'm sure you guys in Europe can get your hands on it as well, probably from a different maker. Make sure you're spraying with that. You can do it preventively or you can spray in reaction to tip blight manifesting on your trees. But either way, make sure you have that in your arsenal. And again, this is listed on our PDF for fungicides and pesticides down below. Now, when it comes to other diseases this time of year, you're actually potentially going to see cedar apple rust galls forming on your junipers. So make sure you're looking out for those. If you do see those form at this time of year, make sure to go ahead and cut those out so that they don't become those pustules, those orange pustules in the spring with the spores that end up traveling for miles and affecting your juniper bonsai in the garden. Now, in terms of pests at this time of year, you're not really going to run into much of an issue on junipers. Still good to go ahead and spray preventively with some sort of systemic, maybe once or twice in the fall, but you should be good otherwise, and you don't really have to worry too much about junipers in that regard. Now, in terms of fertilization in the fall, I recommend that the last application be about 4 weeks before you expect the trees to start going dormant, which means basically about 4 weeks before the first average frost date in your area. So for example, here in Nashville, our first average frost date every year is around November 1st. So the last application of fertilizer, particularly the fertilizer that I put on the soil surface, will be usually in early October, for example. This will be about the last time that I would foliar feed the trees as well with something like liquid kelp and fish. And that allows the trees and the fertilizer to sort of taper off going into dormancy. In regards to pruning and wiring and styling in the fall, I recommend that the last pruning of the shoot growth, those elongating tips, be done somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6 to 8 weeks before your first average frost date. So again, here in Nashville, our first frost date is usually November 1st. So I'll do my last shoot pruning on junipers sometime around mid-September. And that gives you enough time for the trees to flush out one more time and essentially harden off before the frost comes. Now, unlike deciduous trees, where if the new shoots haven't fully hardened off before frost hits the plants and they die off, junipers, that's not going to happen. So even if the trees are pruned a little bit later than that, and that new growth hasn't fully hardened off before the first frost hits, not really that big a deal, but I always like to get one last full push of growth before that happens. So for us, that's usually mid-September when I do my last shoot pruning on these trees. Now, that being said, you can do major styling in the fall, removing whole branches on the plants, cleaning up the undersides of the pads, for example, removing crotch growth, all of that kind of stuff throughout the entire fall season without much of a worry. So this is actually the time of year I would recommend to go ahead and do, say, branch splitting, applying raffia, major heavy bends on these branches. Anytime, say, in like October, November, when the temperatures start dipping down, maybe getting somewhat close to freezing, basically fall season, right? All of us know what that feels like. That's when you're going to start doing some of this heavy bending. The trees are going to respond the best to that treatment at that time of year, particularly if you're doing heavy bending and you can protect the trees from heavy frost in the winter. That's the best time of year to do those major bends on these trees. So I'll save most of our big projects here until, say, mid-October through, say, mid-November, somewhere in that range, to do those heavy bends. And we've never had an issue with major dieback on these trees or issues with the entire plant dying off as a result of making major bends in the fall. So first up in our winter season here, let's talk about protection or overwintering. Now, a vast majority of the junipers that we work with in bonsai are relatively high elevation trees, so they can take extremely low temperatures. So I will actually leave most of our junipers outside in the elements all winter long, and we get pretty cold here. So usually in the month of February, we'll get down to somewhere in the neighborhood of around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I think, -8 or -9 degrees Celsius. It's very, very cold. And the trees don't seem to skip a beat. Now, the smaller the tree, the more likely I am to protect it, maybe putting it in the cold frame, for example, to keep the heavy frost off of it, or placing trees on the ground. So for example, this tree right next to me here, I would probably put this tree on the ground just to get some radiant heat from the ground, making sure to keep the root system of the tree a little bit warmer than if it were up on the bench. But I don't really worry about the temperatures getting low, affecting the foliage or snow landing on these trees. That's not going to hurt them at all whatsoever. And some of the larger trees that are too big for me to put on the ground by myself, I'll leave those up on the bench all winter long, and we've never had any issue here. And we've got even colder than those temperatures that I just mentioned, and the trees didn't skip a beat the following year. Now, if you've done heavy work on these trees in the fall, say you've done heavy bending or you've cut off a lot of foliage in the fall going into winter dormancy, you're going to want to make sure to protect these trees a little bit. Ideally, if you can keep them kind of at or slightly above freezing, that would be best. But this is only if you've done major work on the tree in the fall. If you've done just kind of basic detail wiring in the fall, the trees can stay outside for the most part, and you're not going to see any deleterious effects to the tree overall or the tree's health. Now, in the winter, these trees will turn kind of a purpley brown color depending on the cultivar or the species. And this is what's called shimoyake in Japanese. It just translates to frost burn. It's not damage to the tree. Don't worry about it. Sometimes the trees almost look like they're dead in the winter. They turn completely brown. That's totally fine. As a matter of fact, in Japan, there's this saying that the deeper purple or the deeper brown an Itoigawa turns in the winter, the better the foliage is. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's kind of a cool thing that you hear from professionals and from collectors around Japan. It's one thing that they look for when they're selecting out Itoigawa for bonsai. Now, if you are concerned about your junipers in the winter and you do want to provide a little bit of protection for them, there's absolutely nothing wrong with keeping them like at or around freezing, even if you've done nothing to them in the previous fall season. Or if the trees are going into an exhibition in the winter, for example, and you want them to look nice and green for the show, just like at the Kokufu in Japan, which is held in February, you can put the trees under protection so they don't get that frost burn on them, and they'll stay green all winter long. As a matter of fact, if you want to put a juniper in the Kokufu in February in Japan, it has to be green. It can't be purple. So all of these trees have to be protected leading up to the prejudging and leading up to going in the exhibition. So it all depends on what you want to do. It's okay to be a little bit overprotective with these guys, but if you don't feel like building a cold frame or you don't feel like having to move the trees in and out, putting them on the ground is typically enough for most juniper bonsai in the winter. Now, in terms of watering in the winter, really these trees don't need a tremendous amount of it, but you want to make sure that they're not drying out too much either. So one mistake I see people make, just like in the fall, is that they'll lightly sprinkle water on the soil surface, a couple times a week, and expect that to be enough for the tree. But the problem is the core of the root ball, again, is drying out little by little over time. And at some point, it ends up killing off portions of the tree, potentially killing off the entire tree. So when it comes to watering, make sure you're still checking every day once a day is usually enough for a check, and water as the soil surface becomes dry, just like you would in the summer season, for example. So this means you might have to water once per day. It means you might have to water once every 3 days or every 5 days. It just depends on the situation with the tree. If the trees are staying pretty much frozen for the most part, it's still good to go ahead and water the soil surface just to make sure that some water is being taken up by the plant. You don't want to leave it for too long, but don't worry too much about it if they're frozen. It's a natural thing that happens with these trees at high elevations. They've evolved to sort of withstand that for long periods during the winter, so not really that big a deal, but I still like to go ahead and water the soil surface even when they're frozen, because again, some of that will be absorbed up into the tree, and we can just make sure that it's not drying out too much. Now, you're probably not going to need to do foliar misting in the winter unless you're keeping the trees in, say, a cold frame or a greenhouse where you're keeping the temperatures like right at or above freezing, for example. Then it might not be a bad idea to mist the foliage every once in a while, maybe once a day max, something like that would be fine. But other than that, you don't really have to worry about misting the foliage during the dormant season. Now, for fertilization in the winter, they really don't need anything. So you can remove those cakes or those tea bags that you put on in the fall because they'll be spent by this time. Take those off the soil surface. Don't worry about foliar feeding the trees either, and just let the plants go dormant. You don't really need to do anything in terms of feeding until spring rolls around the next year. Now, for fungicides and pesticides in the winter, again, you don't have to worry about too much, but on the fungicides end of the spectrum, I would recommend as the trees go dormant or after they've gone dormant, using something like lime sulfur or copper to treat the trees. If you're going to use lime sulfur, make sure they've gone totally dormant, particularly Juniperus rigida and Juniperus communis. If those trees haven't turned their typical winter color, like purple or brown, for example, because of that shimoyake or frost burn, and you spray with lime sulfur, you could end up killing portions of the tree off. They really do not like treatment with lime sulfur. So just make sure they're fully dormant. They've gone through several frosts already, color has changed, and then you can apply that. Or if you don't want to use lime sulfur because you don't like the white cast that it leaves on the foliage, you can use something like copper, treat it as soon as they go dormant, and then you're good to go for the rest of the winter. You don't have to treat again later in the winter season. In regards to wiring and pruning these trees in the winter, you can do a lot of work at this time of year as long as you're providing the necessary protection. So if you are going to be doing major cutbacks or heavy bends and major movement to the branches in the winter, make sure that you have a place to protect them, like a cold frame or a greenhouse, for example, ideally keeping them at or above freezing if at all possible. If not, wait until later in the winter before things start waking up, late winter, not necessarily early spring, but kind of towards the end of the winter season to do any major bends. That way you don't have to worry too much about deep cold after making those major bends on the tree. Now, if you're wanting to do, say, like detail wire work on these trees, you can do that anytime during the winter, not an issue at all. And you don't really need to provide protection after the fact. So a lot of these trees, again, if I run out of time in the fall, say we're doing our heavy bends in the fall on a lot of major projects, and I just don't have time to detail up a lot of plants, I'll save those for winter projects, detail them up then, and then we'll just put them right back out either on the bench or on the ground, depending on the size of the tree. Last but not least, in the latter part of the winter season, this is a great time to do scion grafting or side veneer grafting on your junipers. So for example, this is a Rocky Mountain juniper right next to me here that I grafted years ago using the scion grafting method, applying Itoigawa Shinpaku foliage to the tree. So what you want to do is wait until the last couple of weeks of winter and start moving the understock trees, or those trees that you want to change the foliage on, into a protected area like a cold frame or into the workshop, for example, to start waking those trees up a little bit early. At the same time, you want to leave the scion material. So say, for example, if you're using Itoigawa scions, leave those outside in the elements so that they stay dormant up until the point when you want to actually graft that material onto the understock trees. So for us here, that's going to be the very end of winter, usually like the last week of February, maybe even like the first week of March, going into super early spring is when I'll then take those scions from outside, cut them off, and then insert them into the receiving or understock trees that are already in the cold frame and already awake. By having the understock trees already awake and grafting dormant scions into them, that allows for the scions to essentially adhere almost instantaneously as they wake up. The understock trees are already flushing out, they're already moving and pumping a lot of juice through the tissue essentially, and you get really good alignment and really high success rate if you do it that way. So if you want more information on how to actually apply scion grafts on junipers, definitely check out the Juniper tab in the Bonsai U library, and you can see exactly how this technique is done. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Bonsai U, walking you through all 4 seasons of how to properly treat and deal with juniper bonsai. It's one of my favorite group of species when it comes to building bonsai. As you can tell, I've got a lot of these trees in my nursery, and I've become somewhat well known for my work with junipers because it's just such a fun tree to work with. There's such a diversity and a range of foliar types and deadwood characteristics and interesting things that you can do with these trees.
So thank you guys. Questions that came in. Okay. 1 second here. Okay. All right. Going from Kathy. Kathy says, how do you get rid of termites on collected California junipers? That's a very good question. You know, most of the time, nearly always, the termites are going to be in the already dead portions of the tree. So it's not like you can treat with a systemic and expect that to be taken up into the tissue of the plant and then kill off the termites. So really probably your best option is going to be to try to dig out the channels of the termites as much as possible and then treat with something like malathion should actually take care of them if you spray it directly on the termites. But there's probably some other termiticides that are out there that you could use that would target them more directly. I've never had an issue here in my nursery with termites, so I don't know exactly the best treatment for them, but I would imagine you would need to carve out the channels or at least try to expose as many of those as possible and then spray directly. Let's see here. All right, Sang Tran is saying, you had mentioned before spraying malathion or other chemicals for mites every 4 days. How long do you leave the chemical on the tree? So yeah, when you spray, you know, any of these chemicals, most of them anyway, they're designed to basically coat the plant and then kill what's ever on the plant very, very quickly. You know, if you're applying it as a spray. Granular is a little bit different story. But if you're spraying on the tree, even if it rains like, you know, 2-3 hours later, for the most part, most of these chemicals will have taken care of, you know, at least topical chemicals will have taken care of whatever the pest or disease was. If it's a systemic, most of them will have been taken up into the tree again if it was done at the right time of day when the stomata are open, which is usually earlier in the day. If you're spraying your trees in the hotter parts of the day, which I don't recommend you do, but if you do spray a systemic, say at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon when it's very, very hot, and then it rains like 2 hours later, it probably hasn't been taken up into the tree enough to inoculate the plant. So you're probably going to want to respray at a better time when there's not rain afterwards and when it's not the middle of the day. All right, Kathleen's saying, Jonas had a chart that showed that when the foliage stops growing, the roots of many species are growing more actively. Would it make sense to feed roots during that time? Yeah, most definitely. You know, so for example, like during the summer dormant period, quite often trees will start putting on a lot of roots, particularly towards the end of the summer dormant period. A lot of plants will produce a new flush of roots at that time of year, particularly pines. So this is actually why, you know, repotting pines during or towards the end of summer dormancy is actually not a bad idea. White pines in particular respond really well to this, red pines as well. So yes, you know, probably wouldn't necessarily hurt to maybe root drench some of your trees, you know, as the foliage slows down, root drench them with something like the liquid kelp and fish. I mean, you could foliar feed them as well. There's no reason not to, but wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing to focus a bit more on the roots during those periods. Donna is asking, are cryptomeria treated the same as junipers as you have talked here? Anything special about cryptomeria? Yeah, so I would equate cryptomeria somewhat similarly to, say, needle junipers, for example, or procumbens, for example. So yes, you can go through and actually, you know, cut back any of those elongating shoots anywhere within the shoot where the shaft is green, or you can actually pinch them as well. So you can get pretty aggressive with cryptomeria. Pushing them back. So yeah, somewhat similar to like a rigid, I would say, or a procumbens. Rita saying, California trees don't really go dormant like where you are. We often continue with light amounts of fertilizer. What are your thoughts? Yeah, if you guys are in parts of California, like Southern California, for example, where I mean, it's hot all the time. The trees are going to continue to grow pretty much all year long. That being said, the daylight hours do get a little bit shorter in the winter, so the trees are probably going to slow down a little bit. And even in the hotter areas, this is true. So that being said, it doesn't really matter if you continue to fertilize through the winter. It's actually probably a good idea through the winter season, even though the trees are technically kind of partially going into dormancy. That's fine. As a matter of fact, it's not terrible to continue to fertilize your conifers even in an environment like where I am here, particularly like foliar feeding, for example. The trees are still photosynthesizing even when they're dormant, and they're still going to take up some nutrients through the foliage. It's just minimal amounts. So I usually completely cut it here in the winter and don't worry about it at all. But there's nothing wrong with doing it. It's a little bit of a waste maybe monetarily and in terms of the product that you're using, but the trees are taking it up. So yeah, if you're living in a warmer environment where they're not fully dormant, totally cool, and actually not a bad idea to keep fertilizing all winter long. Samuel is saying, in climates where it doesn't get that cold and junipers don't put on fall color, would you still recommend lime sulfur as a dormant spray? Did the nursery apprentice in Osaka use it? Yeah, so I would say probably don't use lime sulfur on your junipers. Well, you could use it on most of your junipers, but if you've got rigida or common juniper, don't use it on those plants if you're not getting full dormancy. If you've got chinensis or Rocky Mountain junipers or anything like that, yeah, you could spray it on there. And you could go as low as like 2 tablespoons per gallon with the lime sulfur. It's not going to turn the trees white if you do that. Really like 2 tablespoons to 5 tablespoons per gallon really won't turn your trees white. Once you start getting up to like 7 or 8 tablespoons per gallon, yes, it's going to treat the trees a bit better in terms of treating fungal problems or pests on the plant, but it's going to start turning them a white cast, which a lot of people don't like. That's usually gone by the time you get to the spring season. It's not really a big deal. But if you're not getting full fall color or full winter color rather, you might hold off on using the lime sulfur and maybe just use copper just for safety's sake. Where I worked in Japan at Fujikawa-san's nursery at Fujikawa Kokan, we did not spray in the winter with lime sulfur. As a matter of fact, we didn't spray much at all. About halfway through my apprenticeship, Fujikawa-san ended up getting cancer. He had a tumor behind one of his eyes and ended up having to have radiation therapy and ended up going blind in one of his eyes. And after that point, we didn't know if it was from the fungicides and pesticides being sprayed so frequently prior to that caused it, or if it was some other issue. But he became very, very leery about spraying stuff in the nursery. So we cut down the spraying to like twice per growing season, and that was it, which worked out okay in that context because the nursery is like a green oasis in a concrete jungle. So there's nothing else around that could transfer disease into the nursery. Whereas my nursery, we're out in the middle of like the boonies here. There's woods all around us. There's all sorts of problems, pests, diseases, everything that can come into the garden. So I spray much more frequently here. So yeah, to answer your question, we really didn't do much of that at the nursery in Japan. Aaron is asking, do you recommend collecting junipers in the late winter? Yeah, late winter going into spring is always good. When I talk to, the guys like from Backcountry Bonsai, for example, who collect out in Wyoming, they're collecting most of their trees like May, June, maybe even in like late April, for example. But what they're waiting for is the snow to melt up at the high elevation. So technically that is late winter there going into spring, even though it's super, super late. But that's based on their elevation and their climate there. So yeah, late winter going into early spring is usually the best time to collect junipers. Now you can collect in the fall as well, as long as you can protect them over the winter. But from most of the collectors that I've spoken to, the best time is late winter going into early spring. Let's see here. Got one from George or Jorge. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Any advice for propagating juniper cuttings? Yeah, so the best time, in my opinion, to propagate juniper cuttings is, at least for us here, is going to be sometime in May. But the visual thing you're looking for on the trees to determine when to take the cuttings is you want the shoots to elongate, and you want the new shoots at the base, right where they're starting to change kind of yellow to brown, which is going to be usually in late spring going to early summer. Right as they're turning kind of yellow to brown, starting to lignify right at the base of the new shoot, that's the time to cut the cuttings, strike the cuttings. And you want to cut the cuttings at that location where they're kind of turning brown to yellow. That seems to be the best place where they're starting to lignify. So again, I don't know, it depends on where you are in California. Northern California is probably going to be more similar to us in timing. Southern California is probably going to be a little bit earlier, maybe, I don't know, late March, April, sometime in that range, when you'd want to take the cuttings, but you want to see the first flush start pushing pretty far out, and then starting to lignify a little bit. And just to add to that, you want to make sure that you're keeping the cuttings, the foliage on the cuttings moist, but not keeping the soil medium that they're in super wet, because it'll cause rot. One of the best mixes you can use for cuttings, and this is true across the board, no matter the species, is mixing ProMix and perlite. And you can do like 50-50 ProMix and perlite. And then if you can keep a misting system going where for the first little while they're getting misted every few minutes for a few seconds, that's the best. Most people can't do that. So as long as you're at least misting them a couple times a day and trying to keep the humidity up, that usually ends up working out pretty well. All right, got one from Catherine. Catherine's asking, are some of these guidelines applicable to Hinoki cypress or any other evergreens? Yeah, so in terms of like timing for pruning, pruning Hinoki cypress is very similar to junipers. So usually for us, early June and then late August, early September is when I do my pruning on Hinoki. So you're getting a similar amount of growth, similar amount of ramification. The type of pruning that we apply to Hinokis can be similar to junipers, and we can also apply a different technique. So you can do scissor pruning on Hinokis where you're pruning out just the elongating shoots, and you get a very soft kind of naturalistic look to the trees. Or you can actually pinch Hinoki cypress, which I do not recommend that you do with junipers. So if you pinch Hinoki cypress, you'll get a very tight secondary flush, and they'll actually flush again from the pinched tips, where junipers typically don't do that. So you can produce, very tight, compact growth, but sometimes it ends up looking a bit pom-pommy if you're not careful, if you're not, wiring properly and adjusting some of the branch tips to compensate for the pinching. So I usually do kind of a combination of scissor pruning and pinching, and that gives me tight foliage with a bit more of a natural soft look. Tung is asking a question about shade structures. If we were to design a custom pergola structure for the summer heat for a bonsai bench, would it be advised to make the pergola be removable for the winter, or would it be okay to have it fixed year round? What light percentage should the pergola let through? Yeah, so it's okay to have it up all winter long. That's completely fine. As a matter of fact, most of my shade cloth I pull back really about this time of year as we get kind of to late September, but there are a couple of sections that I'll leave out all winter long, and I'll actually put some trees under there that need a little bit more protection from hard frost, because you'd be surprised that the shade structure or the shade cloth actually stops some hard frost from landing on the trees. That being said, if you're building a pergola and if you're putting up shade cloth on the pergola, it depends on where you're located and how dry and hot your area is. The drier and hotter it is, the more sun you're getting, the higher percentage cut you want. So like for me here in Nashville, I use 30 or 40% depending on the species. Like deciduous are under 40%, some of the conifers under 30%. If you're living, like I have a client in El Paso, he's sometimes using like 60-70% cut on some of his trees in the summer. So it does depend on where you live and the species that you're working with. Noah is saying, most of the lime sulfur products available in the US are sold for gin and shari and don't actually list concentrations anymore for use as a dormant spray. Any suggestions how to figure this out and what to buy and what concentration is safe to spray with? Yeah, so if you buy like gin seal or top gin, like that kind of stuff is usually diluted like 50-50. I think what's being done is like the concentrated version is being purchased and then diluted down and then being repackaged and sold for use, in bonsai. So you're better off buying the concentrated version. If you can find it online, there's a product called high yield lime sulfur. That's concentrated, 100% lime sulfur, and then you can dilute it to whatever amount you want. And like I said earlier, between like 2 to 5 tablespoons per gallon, I usually do it at 5 tablespoons per gallon, is pretty good. And you're not going to get too much of a white cast on your trees if you do that. Marin is saying, is it okay to use bonide infused systemic disease control in granulars throughout the fall and winter as preventative? Yeah, absolutely. If you are averse to using sprays, fungicides or pesticides because, of the risk of breathing it in or getting it on your skin, you can use granular all season long, all growing season long, and even in the fall going into winter as well. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I would recommend you alternate back and forth between things. Like you can get a Cleary's granular, and you can get infused granular and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So I'd alternate back and forth between those through the growing season, and that should take care of it. If you see a disease on your plants, you're probably better off spraying something on it because it's going to take care of it immediately, whereas a granular is going to be a bit of a delay. But if you're doing it just preventively, yeah, granular all season long is totally cool. Chris is saying, do you proactively treat junipers with any of these systemic / treatments if they are otherwise healthy? Yeah, so I spray, basically, it depends on the time of year, but most of the growing season, I'm going every other month with a fungicide and every other month with a pesticide. Now, when it comes to like spring and fall, because of the temperature change, there's a lot of disease at that time of year, so I'm spraying much more frequently with different fungicides at those times of year, but it's all preventative. Yes, it's dangerous to do that because you're breathing this stuff in. I mean, you should be wearing a suit and the proper mask and whatnot, respirator and all that kind of stuff. But we've got so many trees here that are very high quality trees, somewhat expensive trees. So I spray preventively rather than in response to something emerging on the plants. John is saying, are you coming out to the Pacific Bonsai Expo? I would love to come out for it, but unfortunately we've got classes that we're running at the nursery here, intensive classes that were already booked, over a year ago. So unfortunately I won't be able to make it out, but it looks like it's going to be an awesome show. So I'm really upset that I'm not going to be able to come to it. Rita saying lime sulfur technically isn't legal in California now. You might be able to buy it as like a use, like veterinary use. They use it, vets use it all the time for disinfecting, dogs and cats. So you might be able to get it through that route in a concentrated form. So you might, if you got a veterinary friend, you might talk to them about, see if you can't get a hold of it that way. Let's see. Can you talk about treatment of juniper scale? Yeah, I've never had an issue with scale at my nursery here, so I've never really had to treat for it. So I'm not exactly sure what the best, spray or treatment would be for something like that. I do know that, a lot of people confuse, on particular our native junipers here, sap being leached through the soil, or not through the soil, through the foliage rather, as scale by accident. So if you look at like a lot of, say, like Western junipers, Sierra junipers, sometimes on Rocky Mountain junipers as well, you'll see little white dots all over the foliage in the summer. That's not scale. It's actually sap being leached through the foliage. So you don't need to treat for that. I remember being at a show actually out in California. I think it wasn't Riverside. I think it was up in Sacramento last time I was out there for the GSBF. Somebody had a Western juniper in the show, and one of the bonsai professionals who was critiquing the show was going on and on and on about how could this other person let this tree in the show with all of the scale all over it. But it wasn't scale, it was just sap, leaching through the foliage. So just make sure you're not confusing one for the other. Jeff is saying, do you plan on attending the Kokofu 10 in February? Any advice for a first-time visitor, assuming it's open? Yeah, if everything is opened up, we're actually going to start our Japan tours back up this coming February. So we're waiting on Japan to officially make the announcement that the borders are back open. They're like right on the edge. They're talking about it. We watch the Japanese news in the house here like every day, just to see, well, to keep our language skills up, but also to see when the doors are going to open back up so we can take our tours again. And they're hinting at it right now, so I think it's going to move in that direction. If you're a first-time visitor, I think you should join our tour and come with us. And when I say us, it's my wife and I. We put the tour on together. But if you want to go solo, staying in the Ueno area near the Tokyo Metropolitan Museum, you definitely want to stay in that area, and then kind of base yourself from there, and then you can kind of make little side day trips as you go. But it's not too difficult to get around Japan. Most of the areas will have signs in English. The train system can get a little bit confusing sometimes, but there's a lot of apps now that'll kind of help you navigate that.